At 0215 hours local time, the temperature in the Siberian taiga had already dropped well below -30 degrees Celsius. No wind, no movement, no sound except the distant mechanical groan of steel contracting in the cold. And in that absolute freezing darkness, a single figure moved through knee-deep snow toward a gray metal box half buried in a snowdrift beside the Russian mainline railway. To anyone watching, and there was no one watching, it looked like nothing, just another utility cabinet bolted to a concrete post beside thousands of kilometers of empty track. Unremarkable, forgettable, invisible. That was exactly the problem. That box was one of thousands scattered across the largest railway network on Earth, and the Russian military had almost completely stopped thinking about them. They were guarding ammunition depots, they were watching airfields, they were hardening command bunkers. Nobody was watching the boxes. And in the next 3 hours, that oversight would trigger one of the most devastating logistical catastrophes of the entire conflict. 7 trains, hundreds of millions of dollars in military hardware, weeks of operational paralysis. All of it traced back to a decision made long before the war began to secure the weapons and ignore the nervous system connecting them. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand what the Russian military machine actually runs on, because it is not fuel alone, and it is not manpower alone. It runs on rail. The Russian armed forces depend on the railway network to move over 60% of all their heavy military equipment, artillery shells, armored vehicles, and bulk fuel to active front lines. This is not a preference or a tradition, it is a physical and mathematical necessity. Highways in Russia, especially in the east, degrade rapidly under the weight of armored convoys. A single main battle tank can destroy a civilian road surface in hours, but railways distribute that weight differently. Hardened steel rails on reinforced ballast beds can absorb the tonnage of continuous military freight movement without collapsing, so the trains keep moving, day and night, loaded with everything an army at war consumes. And they move at a scale that is almost impossible to fully comprehend until you see the numbers written down in front of you. A single fully loaded military freight consists 70 cars of ammunition, artillery shells, and diesel, weighs approximately 6,000 metric tons. That is not a typo. 6,000 tons of mass moving at 75 kilometers per hour through darkness and frozen forest. The kinetic energy contained in that single train is equivalent to a continuous rolling artillery strike. Stopping it is not simple. Even under full emergency braking, that train will slide forward for at least 1.5 kilometers before it halts completely. On ice-polished rails in sub-zero temperatures, that stopping distance increases dramatically. The entire signaling architecture of the railway exists for one fundamental reason: to keep those iron giants separated by enough invisible distance that they never occupy the same space at the same time. That signaling system operates through a network of relay cabinets, small gray metal boxes bolted beside the track every 2 to 3 kilometers across the entire network. Each cabinet controls the automated traffic signals and switch logic for its designated block of track. It constantly communicates with the regional dispatch center, confirming block status, transmitting telemetry, and receiving authorization sequences. When a train enters a block, the cabinet registers the occupancy and turns the signal red for any following traffic. When the train clears the block, the cabinet resets the signal to green. Simple in concept, catastrophically fragile in practice, because if that cabinet stops communicating, if it goes dark for any reason, the entire automated system defaults to its worst-case assumption: red, stop, do not move. The fail-safe is total. And an operative who understands that architecture does not need explosives to shut down a railway, they only need to silence the box. At 0215 hours, the figure reached the cabinet and pried the door open with a steel crowbar. Inside, neat rows of electromagnetic relays, copper bus bars, and processing boards filled the enclosure. The operative did not carry explosives. Explosives are loud, traceable, and difficult to transport across a country with active internal security checkpoints. Instead, the operative carried thermite paste, a dense chemical mixture that burns at over 2,200 degrees Celsius, hotter than the surface of molten lava, hot enough to vaporize copper wiring and melt steel brackets without producing any audible detonation. The paste was applied directly onto the logic boards and primary power distribution terminals. At 02:20 hours, the mixture was ignited and the operative retreated into the tree line. What followed was not an explosion, it was a hiss, a blinding white flare no louder than a cutting torch. Within 30 seconds, the cabinet's internal circuitry had been reduced to a pool of glowing slag. Molten copper dripped onto the snow below and froze into twisted metallic shapes. The cabinet went completely dark. 400 kilometers away, inside the regional dispatch center at Novosibirsk, a controller watching an illuminated trackboard saw the telemetry for that block simply vanish. One moment the line was green and nominal, the next a red indicator appeared, and then a cascade of automated error warnings flooded across the monitoring system. The fail-safe engaged across the entire sector. Inside the cab of train number 472, moving westbound at 75 kilometers per hour, with 70 cars of artillery ammunition and diesel fuel, the trackside signal flashed from green to red in an instant. The engineer had 3 seconds before the automated pneumatic braking sequence engaged without his input. Brake pressure dropped, cast iron shoes slammed against steel wheels across all 70 cars simultaneously. Sparks erupted into the snow. The screech of metal against metal tore through the frozen forest. A plume of metallic smoke and vaporized snow trailed behind the train like a wound. 6,000 tons of moving mass ground against itself for over a kilometer before finally shuddering to a complete stop meters before the dead block section. The train was undamaged, the engineer was shaken but unharmed, and at that precise moment, none of that mattered because the damage had already been done in a completely different dimension, the dimension of time. In the dispatch center, manual backup protocols were immediately initiated. When electronic block signaling fails, railway doctrine requires switching to verbal radio confirmation and paper authorization for every individual train movement. Controllers must manually confirm block clearance, log it by hand, and coordinate each sequential movement with extreme caution. That process drops the operational throughput of the line from 75 kilometers per hour down to 15. Within 45 minutes, 6 additional westbound military supply trains had stacked up behind train number 472, engines idling uselessly in the snow. Over 30,000 tons of combat supplies, motionless, paralyzed by a $10 thermite charge and 30 seconds of chemical reaction. The operatives already knew this would be resolved within 12 to 24 hours. Maintenance crews would reach the cabinet, assess the damage, begin replacement procedures, the signaling block would be restored, the trains would move again. That was acceptable, because this was not the main effort. This was preparation. 50 kilometers further down the same corridor, a second operative was already working in darkness at a manual switching mechanism near a tight curve in the track. The physics of derailment are precise and unforgiving. A railway switch point must seat completely flush against the stock rail to guide wheel flanges safely through a transition. If the switch is left open by even a small gap, the leading wheel flange of an approaching locomotive will strike the diverging rail edge at full speed. The kinetic energy of that impact has nowhere to go except outward, shearing steel bolts, tearing rail off timber ties, and launching the wheel set off the track entirely. The operative unbolted the standard railway lock and wedged a custom-machined piece of hardened steel between the switch point and the stock rail, forcing a gap of exactly 5 centimeters, small enough to be invisible to any engineer looking forward through darkness and snowfall, large enough to be mathematically catastrophic to a heavy locomotive entering a curve at speed. Frost formed over the modification within minutes, covering it beneath a natural veneer of ice that would survive visual inspection from the cab of an approaching train. At 0340 hours, train number 511 approached the compromised curve carrying 40 flatbed cars loaded with newly refurbished armored personnel carriers. The locomotive's headlight cut a narrow tunnel through falling snow. The engineer saw nothing unusual. The train entered the curve at 50 kilometers per hour, and the centrifugal forces of that curve pushed thousands of tons of mass heavily against the outer rail. 0.3 of a second. That is how long it took from the moment the leading left wheel struck the 5-centimeter gap to the moment the 120-ton locomotive left the rails entirely. The wheel rode up and over the trackhead, and the steel giant dropped onto the frozen gravel ballast with a force that registered on seismic monitoring equipment. For the next 200 meters, the locomotive became a plow, its steel body grinding through timber ties, shredding concrete sleepers, and tearing the trackbed apart at the molecular level. The rapid deceleration created a kinetic shockwave that ripped backward through the entire consist. Heavy steel couplings connecting the cars snapped under compressive forces they were never designed to survive. The first 10 flatbeds jackknifed, slamming into each other with the force of an artillery barrage. 60-ton armored personnel carriers snapped their retaining chains and tumbled into the adjacent snow-covered ravine. When the movement finally stopped, 200 meters of primary mainline track had been completely destroyed. The locomotive was a total loss. The armored vehicles were unretrievable wreckage scattered across a frozen hillside. The crew had survived only because the emergency systems had partially cushioned the initial impact sequence. In the dispatch center at Novosibirsk, the total loss of telemetry from train number 511 triggered a system-wide catastrophic alert. All eastbound and westbound traffic across a 150-kilometer radius halted simultaneously. The chief dispatcher attempted to raise the locomotive crew on the encrypted radio network. There was no response. The communications array had been crushed beneath 90 tons of twisted steel in the first second of derailment. And this was not an isolated incident. Within a single 3-hour operational window, Ukrainian operatives had activated identical sabotage protocols at 7 separate strategic choke points across the Trans-Siberian corridor. 7 relay cabinets burned, multiple switching mechanisms compromised, multiple derailments triggered. The probability of 7 simultaneous catastrophic mechanical failures occurring through natural degradation was statistically indistinguishable from zero. The pattern was immediately visible to anyone looking at the full operational map, but by the time anyone was looking at the full operational map, the operatives were already gone. The Russian Military Logistics Command now faced an engineering paradox with no clean solution. Clearing a major derailment in the isolated Siberian taiga requires heavy recovery cranes weighing up to 150 tons. Those cranes travel exclusively by rail, but the rail on both sides of every crash site was now severed. To fix the track, you need the cranes. To move the cranes, you need the track. Engineering doctrine estimates that replacing 200 meters of completely destroyed trackbed in sub-zero conditions with frozen ballast excavation, precision tie laying, rail alignment to millimeter tolerances, and full compaction and ballast resettlement requires a dedicated crew of 50 men working 48 uninterrupted hours under ideal conditions. Multiply that by 7 simultaneous sites spread across thousands of kilometers of remote terrain, and the timeline expands from days into weeks. The primary logistics artery connecting Russian military production centers to the active front had effectively been severed, not by a missile strike, not by an air campaign, by thermite paste, crowbars, and machine steel wedges that together cost less than $5,000.
4,000 kilometers to the west, on the active front lines, the consequences materialized within days. Russian artillery batteries that routinely consumed over 10,000 heavy shells per day received orders to implement immediate rationing protocols. Fuel convoys were delayed. Armored units reduced their operational tempo to conserve reserves. Planned offensive operations were quietly postponed, with no public explanation provided to frontline commanders, many of whom spent days attempting to understand why resupply trains that had previously arrived on predictable schedules had simply stopped coming. They had no way of knowing that their supplies were lying in a frozen ravine in Siberia under 2 meters of snow, next to the crushed wreckage of armored vehicles that had never reached the front. The asymmetry of the operation was almost incomprehensible in its efficiency. Less than $5,000 in materials and equipment had produced over $150 million in immediate, unrecoverable material losses, and had imposed weeks of strategic logistical paralysis on a military conducting active large-scale operations. The Russian Interior Ministry confronted the arithmetic of the problem and found no solution that fit within operational reality. The Russian railway network spans over 85,000 kilometers of track, crossing some of the most remote and inhospitable terrain on the planet. The relay cabinets, switching mechanisms, and blind curbs that represent vulnerable nodes in that network number in the tens of thousands. To provide meaningful security coverage to every one of those nodes against small, mobile, specialized teams operating in darkness would require deploying over 200,000 dedicated security personnel. That is 200,000 soldiers and security forces removed from every other mission, guarding metal boxes in frozen forests indefinitely. The mathematics of asymmetric infrastructure warfare do not favor the defender when the network is this large and the attack surface is this distributed. The saboteurs never needed to breach a fortified position or defeat a security element in direct contact. They needed only to find the unguarded boxes and apply chemistry and physics in the dark. In Novosibirsk and in emergency coordination cells across the Russian logistics command structure, planners worked without stopping to draft contingency routing through secondary branch lines never designed to absorb concentrated military freight throughput at this scale. Aging tracks groaned under redirected tonnage. Maintenance crews reported accelerated rail wear on lines already stressed by sub-zero brittleness. Every improvised workaround that solved one bottleneck quietly created additional fragility 2 steps down the network. The cascading nature of the disruption meant that the initial attack's effects compounded over time rather than diminishing. Logistics is tempo, and tempo, once lost in the middle of active operations, cannot be purchased back. It can only be rebuilt slowly, over time, at great cost, while the battlefield continues to move without waiting for the supply chain to recover. Railway workers stationed along remote sections of track began conducting informal night patrols, scanning tree lines with flashlights, listening for sounds that did not belong to the forest. Some reported hearing nothing and finding nothing for weeks. Others reported finding frost-covered boot tracks in the snow near cabinets that had, as yet, not been touched. The psychological weight of knowing the boxes beside them could be the next target, and that there was no reliable way to prevent it, settled into the daily routine of men who had never previously thought of themselves as being on the front lines of anything. But geographic scale defeated vigilance without density. Flashlight patrols along a network spanning the width of a continent offered security theater, not security. And somewhere in the darkness of the taiga, the calculation was already being made about which boxes to approach next, and when, and how, and at what cost. The silent war against the nervous system of the Russian war machine had not ended. It had only paused long enough for the smoke to clear.